Hola, buenos días. Bienvenidos a la mesa de premiación Howard F. Cline Book Prize in Mexican History. Yo soy María Teresa Fernandez-Aceves, soy parte del jurado de este premio y antes de iniciar me gustaría señalar que las menciones honoríficas de Richard M. Conway y Daniel Terrazas. Ellos se disculpan por no estar en esta ceremonia de premiación porque Richard está de viaje y Daniel Terrazas, por cuestiones de salud, no le fue posible estar presente. A continuación, paso a leer el acta de premiación. El martes 10 de enero de 2023 se reunió el jurado de Howard F. Cline Prize in Mexican History, integrado por quienes firmamos al calce. De acuerdo con la convocatoria que en su momento se hizo pública y luego de un análisis pormenorizado de las 13 obras concursantes, los jurados llegamos al siguiente veredicto. Obra ganadora: Silvia M. Arrom, La Güera Rodríguez, The Life and Legends of a Mexican Independence Heroine, libro publicado por la Universidad de California Press en 2021. El libro es una biografía de María Ignacia Rodríguez de Velasco. Arrom revisa algunas etapas fundamentales en la vida de La Güera Rodríguez, como su intervención en el movimiento de 1803, su divorcio, sus 3 matrimonios, su posible participación en el movimiento de independencia y sus vínculos con Iturbide, amén de su amistad con el barón de Humboldt y con Fanny Calderón de la Barca. La segunda parte de la investigación analiza cómo y por qué La Güera Rodríguez devino un mito histórico, en especial la dinámica de retomar una y otra vez datos falsos, pero sumamente eficaces. He aquí la gran aportación de la autora. Analiza, deconstruye, escudriña y triangula. Arrom hace un amplio y juicioso uso de fuentes primarias y secundarias en un ejercicio de discernimiento ejemplar. Más allá, la biografía de una mujer de élite ilumina ciertos procesos históricos en la última etapa del periodo novohispano, del movimiento de la independencia y 5 décadas después del México independiente. En todo momento, los argumentos se presentan con claridad y se sustentan en una cuidadosa reflexión intelectual. Obras con mención honorífica: Richard M. Conway, Islands in the Lake, Environment and Ethnohistory in Xochimilco, New Spain, publicado por Cambridge University Press, 2021. En principio, el libro es una historia de Xochimilco antes de la conquista española y a lo largo del todo periodo novohispano. Sin embargo, la obra desborda esa definición y se constituye en una historia política, social y ambiental de un enclave indígena en la Cuenca de México. Destaca el amplio uso de fuentes primarias y de diversas perspectivas metodológicas para establecer los contornos ecológicos de Xochimilco. La investigación muestra cómo los nahuas de Xochimilco ejercieron cierto grado de autonomía de las demandas del sistema colonial, en buena medida gracias a la dinámica socioespacial de los lagos, al cultivo de las chinampas y a un sistema de transporte en canoas. La capacidad disruptiva de las haciendas españolas en el entorno indígena no tuvo en Xochimilco el mismo efecto que en otros ámbitos de la Cuenca de México. El siguiente libro, de Daniel Terrazas Williams, The Capital of Free Women, Race, Legitimacy and Liberty in Colonial Mexico, publicado por Yale University Press, 2021. Es una investigación centrada en las mujeres negras libres de Jalapa y áreas aledañas en el centro del actual estado de Veracruz en el siglo XVII. La fuente principal, pero no única, son los instrumentos notariales que dan cuenta de la compra y venta de tierras y esclavos y las disposiciones testamentarias. El uso de fuentes primarias es amplio y cuidadoso y la originalidad del argumento radica en el uso de las mujeres libres, negras, de sus redes locales y regionales que incluían hacendados, vendedores de esclavos, sacerdotes y jueces para consolidar su condición socioeconómica y la de sus familias. El libro no solo alumbra sobre el comercio de esclavos, incluso por propietarios afrodescendientes en la región, sino sobre el modo en el que el sistema permitía su emancipación. En este contexto, categorías socioculturales como honor y legitimidad resultan especialmente relevantes. Debe considerarse que la investigación pone en cuestión un uso simplista de las nociones de raza y género en el periodo novohispano. Este es el acta. Y bueno, bienvenida Margaret Chowning, ¿verdad? Entonces, ahora Margaret Chowning nos dará una presentación del libro La Güera Rodríguez, The Life and Legends of a Mexican Independence. Ella, bueno, en este panel nos estamos, vamos a usar en inglés y en español. Entonces, you have the word, Margaret.
Okay, great. Thanks, Maria Teresa. So I wasn't sure what it meant exactly to present the book. So I just did what I wanted to do with it, which is revisit it. I read it for the first time for the UC Press, which ended up being privileged to publish it. And I've read it since with my students, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how this book succeeded magnificently with my students. And so I'm just going to indulge my own revisiting of the book and talk a little bit about a little bit more than Maria Teresa did about what's in it. I do want to say first, it's been a pleasure and an honor to be Silvia Arrom's friend and academic companion since we were both graduate students at Stanford, like 45 years and counting. And so I'm very honored also that she asked me to present, whatever that means, this book. The first thing I want to say about it is that it's compellingly readable. It is so accessible to undergraduates. My graduate students loved it also and appreciated, of course, different things about it. But I think I want to emphasize how successful this book is on all levels, not just for graduate students, which is most of the books that we give prizes to are successful with graduate students, I think, but that's not always the case with undergraduates. As Maria Teresa said, it's divided into two parts, both of which bring something different to the scholarly enterprise and also something different to a kind of pedagogical enterprise. So the first part is a kind of debunking of, or no, I don't even want to say debunking. It's an original investigation of the facts of La Güera Rodríguez's life. The reason it has to be so painstaking is, as we see in part two, the dozens, maybe more than that, of people who have invented facts about La Güera and whose own false facts have been adopted by other people and taken as fact, so that this kind of investigation in the archives, tracking down clues. I know Silvia got in touch with me a couple of times while she was writing this book saying, hey, do you have anything on this person or that person? What do you know about this? Really hard-won proof acts in part one of the book. So the question that most people, the undergraduate students for sure, will be asking themselves throughout this first part is the central question of all biographies. How is this person extraordinary? And how do they reveal dimensions of the everyday that are otherwise hard to apprehend? La Guerra perhaps would not have been so famous if she had lived in a different time, but she was witness to and participate in the events leading up to Mexican independence. She was, for her role in these events, she was questioned and banished by the Spanish from Mexico City in March of 1810, which led to rumors that she had aided the rebel cause. It was not so simple as Silvia explains. She did give the rebels money from time to time, but that may have been because she needed to protect her own properties. She was also friendly with some royalists, including Agustin de Iturbide, who was a royalist until the last minute when he wasn't. In short, she was caught up in politics, and perhaps because of her status, her social status, her intelligence, her beauty, because she was, I think this does seem to be a fact, she was a beautiful woman. She was the subject of intense gossip about her political roles, even as she herself was a kind of champion spreader of gossip. La Guerra's political role is part of any argument about her extraordinariness. Excuse me, getting over a cold, as is perhaps her willingness in a Catholic society. I'm going to have to pause for a second. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Her political role is part of any argument about her extraordinary qualities, as is perhaps her willingness in a Catholic society to divorce the abusive husband she married at age 15. Also the strength of her character that allowed her to raise her children and manage her estate and business affairs for long stretches on her own. The fact that she married 3 times, the third time to a 12 years younger man. But we are here in this book in the hands of a careful and measured biographer who has not only doggedly pursued the facts about La Guerra's life to get them right, but who has also made a career of understanding 19th century Mexican women, beginning with her study of ecclesiastical divorce, which I think was published in 1976. I know it was while we were both still in graduate school, and I was pretty intimidated by that. But I think really beginning with the foundational 1985 publication, The Women of Mexico City, 1790 to 1857. So this is somebody who knows more about Mexican women in this period than anybody. She did in 1985. She's continued to publish and think about different dimensions of Mexican women's lives in the 19th century. And so this Silvia Arrom is the perfect person for us to put our trust in, to understand how to sort the ordinary from the extraordinary. And as far as La Guerra's political activity is concerned, Silvia makes clear that her loyalties were quite ambiguous. based in pragmatism more than ideology. She was not the only aristocratic woman living in Mexico City at this time to develop opinions, talk about them broadly. So that was not as extraordinary as it might seem. With regard to her life outside of politics, again, much less out of the ordinary than it might appear to some readers, certainly to most of your undergraduate readers. I'm going to quote Silvia here at some length. La Guerra demonstrated remarkable resilience in confronting personal vicissitudes and adjusting to difficult political and economic times. She did not, however, appear to have challenged the social conventions of her time, place, gender, and elevated social class. Many women became widows and remarried, had numerous children, of whom several died, headed their own households, which is something that our students generally don't know, administered their property and that of their minor children, defended themselves in court, took advantage of their connections to improve their family's position. So my students profited greatly from thinking through this balance between the ordinary and the extraordinary, and they came away with a much richer understanding of the limits on and the possibilities of being an aristocratic woman in early 19th century Mexico. And I think seeing reflected in a single super interesting life, a life well told, seeing reflected in this life some of the hard-won revelations of the social history of women that we've worked to put together over the last 40 years is such an effective way to convey that social history. It's harder to pull off because you have to do a biography as well as the social history, but it's more effective. Okay, part 2 of the book also has great scholarly and pedagogical value. It turns out that the rumors about La Guerra that circulated during her lifetime were only a prelude to the reinvention of her life for various purposes after her death. This reinvention began in around 1900 with extended mentions in works like Guillermo Prieto's Memorias in a kind of gossipy way that insinuated a romantic connection to Iturbide, which is one of the false facts that has real legs throughout the 20th century. It continued in earnest in 1949 when Artemio de Valle Arispe published his historical novel, La Guerra Rodriguez. Silvia analyzes Valle Arispe's book as an expression of national pride. It's 1949, the war is over, the Mexican miracle is underway, pride in Mexico's path to modernity that began with independence at the time of La Guerra. Not only does he play up La Guerra's role in achieving independence, but he also conveys her beauty and, quote, vital exuberance as symbolic of Mexico's own beauty and national exuberance and its own turbulent beginnings. An important part of his treatment of her vitality, however, according to Silvia, is that she ultimately married a third time, settled down, lived quietly. So she achieved a kind of mature modernity symbolized by the resumption of proper gender relations. As Silvia puts it, she was tamed by her third husband. And you can see how this is a kind of book, this is a kind of picture that could come out of that 1949 movement. And it was immensely successful. By the time Valle Arispe died in 1961, the book had gone through 9 editions. It continued to be reprinted as late as 2011. Other people continued to draw on it since it pretended to have been based on facts, but they brought their own preferences to the story, their own times to the story, just as Valle Arispe had done. Some dropped the boring taming of La Guerra by her third husband because it didn't align with the preferences of readers toward the end of the 20th century. As Silvia writes, what made her a favorite for the new era were her supposed glamour and sexual freedom, strength and independence, intelligence, and bold political activism. In short, she became kind of a feminist icon. Before this, she was depicted in films, in plays, in operas, in other historical novels, in texts designed to teach Mexican history to a popular audience. In 1996, she appeared in a telenovela. She had a big role in a 2005 novel by Adolfo Arioja Vizcaíno, where she appears as a kind of good fairy advising a fictional government functionary. She's been working to liberate herself and her country. And in the end, in this novel, all of the other historical figures portrayed, Hidalgo, others, are disappointments, and she's the one, the only one with some heroic qualities. That's 2005. So this is there are great pictures in this part, playbills and movie posters, and students loved this this section. I mean, they really loved both sections, and they liked the way they worked together. And I think as Patty, they didn't just like it, they learned from it, because Silvia's commentary throughout this second part emphasizes the way facts can be distorted, the way new ones can be introduced, and then they go as fact. I mean, these are things we all know about, of course, but how the interpretation of history changes over time and how misinformation gets embedded is a pretty timely lesson for students to learn, and learn it in a way that is exciting to them, not just palatable, but exciting to them. Now, of course, Silvia's book is not the first book in our field to undertake a study of how a figure or an image is treated differently by different audiences over time. And think of Eddie Wright Rios's Searching for Madre Matiana, which is, I think, also a successful effort in this direction. But it's certainly one of the most successful in a general way, and definitely one of the most successful as a teaching tool. Certainly entirely worthy of the Howard F. Cline Prize in Mexican History.
Well, thank you, Margaret, and thank you, Maria Teresa. I am delighted, Maria Teresa, that the prize committee liked my book, and I am delighted, Margaret, that your students liked my book, because that was an audience, undergraduates, that I was really aiming for. And you know, this book for me was, in a sense, it was a labor of love. It was a book that took me in some new directions, but actually brought me back to where I started. So it has a very special place in my heart. For one thing, it took me back to this figure of La Guerra Rodriguez that I was fascinated with since I was an undergraduate. And I met her when I read Fanny Calderón de la Barca's Life in Mexico in a senior seminar. So that was probably 1970. So that was a long time ago. That was 53 years ago. And then I found her ecclesiastical divorce case when I was doing my dissertation in Mexico City, and I published a long selection from it in 1976 while I was still a graduate student, as Margaret mentioned. And then I kept finding little bits and pieces about her as I went on, and I filed them away in my file cabinet. And now I've come back to her. So for me, this is full circle. And it's also full circle because I'm back to women's history where I started. After I wrote The Women of Mexico City, I went on to study the poor, popular politics, social welfare, charity organizations, always thinking about gender, but now this is straight women's history, at least the first part of the book. And in the time period where I started, because gradually I've been moving forward. I got as far as 1913 in my previous book, but now I'm back to that first time period, which is her lifetime. She was born in 1778 and she died in 1850. So I was able to flesh out what a real woman's life was like in that time period, what made her happy, what made her sad, how she dealt with the numerous problems she encountered, how she defended herself in lawsuits, how she furthered her family's interest, et cetera, et cetera. But something else that I really wanted to do in that section, and I'm glad Margaret picked up on this, is that her story allowed me to reiterate some of the points that I have spent my career making about women's lives in this period. We have some very deep-seated stereotypes, which I guess some of your students had when they read the book, if they were surprised by some of what she did, like heading her own household. And something that I did in my first book was to challenge or try to challenge some of these deep-seated stereotypes. For example, that women had the same status, legal status as minors. Well, that is not true. That's Roman law, but it is absolutely not true in Hispanic law, or that they were subject to lifelong guardianship. You know, I keep reading that. I keep reading that as late as last month when I was reading something. It's like these stereotypes don't die, but one thing that I tried to do in this book is to point out that that's not the way things were for a woman at this time. So it brought me full circle on women's history. It brought me, in a sense, or at least tied together some of the strands of my teaching over the past almost 50 years. Because I noticed increasingly over time that many students believe anything that a professor assigns. So a big part of my teaching was to show students how to evaluate texts, how to discern their biases, how to spot disinformation. And that's really what the second half of the book does, very explicitly. I mean, historians are always evaluating texts. How reliable is it? You know, what could it have? Where are the silences? What could it have distorted? But here it's very explicit, you know. It's partly an exercise in fact-checking. It's also an exercise in looking at and analyzing the changing representations over time, which I think are fascinating. And they reflect the changing cultural context. They reflect each author's ideology, their fantasies of what kind of a woman would have lived, they would have liked to have seen live in the early 19th century. Did they want a sexy dame? Apparently many of them did. And did they want an intrepid, bold heroine who wanted independence from the start? Apparently they did, even though she was neither one of those two. Well, she may have been sexy, I don't know. But she didn't have all the affairs that Valladolid claimed that she had. So we see her go from being a very proper aristocratic lady at the beginning of the 20th century to who never got involved in politics, because that wasn't something women were supposed to do in the early 20th century, to a highly sexualized, promiscuous heroine with Valladolid in 1949, who was finally tamed by a man, her last husband, because Valladolid couldn't face having a transgressive woman who, you know, challenged convention. He had to somehow, he didn't want a woman who challenged patriarchy in his book. And then with the rise of the feminist movement, authors are looking for strong women in the past. And she became the wise woman, the feminist ahead of her time, the fully liberated political actor who defied convention. And that's what she's celebrated for today. She really did not defy convention. The only convention I found that she defied is that she married a man who was 12 years younger. And the very interesting thing that I found by reading her marriage certificate and then some censuses that I found for later years is that she lies about her age. So these are very dry sources. I did not find her personal archives, which I would have loved to have been able to get into her mind. But even in this perfectly dry census material, I see how each time a census taker comes along, she makes herself younger. So she's not so much older than her husband. And in the last census, 1848, 2 years before she died, she says she's younger than he is. So she did defy convention by marrying a much younger man. That was unusual. But everything else she did was not defying convention. She was doing what an upper class, well-educated woman who lived in Mexico City often did. It was, you know, a very sociable life. And Margaret's told you about, I think she read some of my book that talked about some of the things that she did. Now, I tried not to be too heavy-handed here, but the book does have a pedagogical purpose. I'm really glad that your students liked it. And just as this book brought me full circle, it also took me in new directions, which I found very exciting because we don't always just want to repeat what we've done in the past. So for one thing, biography. I could never have written a biography of an aristocratic woman 50 years ago when I started graduate school, which was 1971. I was part of a militant group of social historians who reacted against studying elites, and we focused on the lower classes. We didn't study individuals, we studied groups of people. And in fact, biography was really out of fashion in 1971. And then came some changes in the literature. We had microhistory, books like Carlo Ginzburg's, The Cheese and the Worms, that show the importance of microhistory to understanding macro processes, that we could test abstract conclusions with case studies. And then a bit later, we got the so-called new biography that brought biography back into favor. But it was a different kind of biography, no longer just studying the great men, but also less famous people, men and women, focusing on their private lives and not just their public accomplishments, showing them warts and all, rather than as exemplary figures to model yourself on. And so it became very obvious to me that there was a lot to be learned from studying an individual life, both about the small details of how daily life was lived at the time, women having lots of children, marrying young in her case, facing, in her case, an abusive husband. She did not actually divorce him. She was not willing to divorce him. And divorce was just separation. He dropped his charges that she had committed adultery because they weren't true. And she went back to him, they had another kid. But she was involved in a very scandalous suit. But we also learn about the big processes, the independence movement. So this took me more in the direction of political and economic history than some of my previous works, because it really showed how Mexico's path to independence was much more complicated and traumatic than what the triumphalist patriotic narratives would have us believe. She, as far as I can tell, and she was never tried as an insurgent, so we don't have a court case where she has to say what she believes. She came to accept a full separation from Spain very gradually. It seems that at the beginning she was aligned with a Criollo group that wanted autonomy, that wanted self-government, until the captured Spanish king, who had been captured by the French, could return to the throne. Then he returned to the throne in 1814. He was a disaster. And so they started saying, well, maybe we don't need to stay in the Spanish system. It took them a while to get there. And what's really interesting about her is that she plays all sides. She tries to keep a very low profile. She doesn't want to get into trouble after she got into trouble for being involved in a little conspiracy in 1809. She gives a little bit of money to the insurgents who have occupied her haciendas, so she doesn't want them to ruin them. It's to protect them, and they use those terms. She uses that term. And it's money that's required. She is forced to give it. We don't even know if it was voluntary. And so her path to accepting independence, having her family, she was very close to Iturbide. Her whole family was close to Iturbide since many decades before. Her family was part of his court. She was not actually part of the court. So we don't even know if she wanted a republic, if she liked the empire. We don't have any of that information, but we are able to see how much uncertainty there was in this period, how a woman like her was trying to play all sides, keep a low profile to protect her family, especially her patrimony, what her children would inherit and what she could live on. It also really shows how devastating the wars were for wealthy families, even if they lived in Mexico City and were far from the battles, because there were no battles in Mexico City. And her finances suffered greatly once those insurgents took over the haciendas that were her main source of income. So it led me more deeply into political and economic history than my previous work on the period. So that's a new direction. Another new direction was that it led me to cultural history and to new sources and a new time period, because now I went all the way through the 20th century into the 21st century to about, I think, I probably finished the book in 2018. I got to 2015 in my sources. And I have to confess what my great rebellion in life was. My father was a professor of Latin American literature and culture. I was very much daddy's little girl, so I became a professor too. But my big rebellion is that I never do literature. I do history, and I don't do intellectual history. I do, very archivally based history, etc. But here I was studying novels and opera libretto and comic books and film scripts and popular histories, which are really more like novels because there's so much, so many false facts and ridiculous stuff in them, blogs and so on. And some of these sources were pretty outrageous. It was lots of fun, but sometimes I was embarrassed. For example, when I ordered a book by Francisco Martín Moreno called Arrebatos Carnales, Carnal Ecstasies, the passions that consumed the protagonists of Mexican history. He has a whole long chapter that is like soft porn, not even so soft sometimes, about her love affair with Iturbide, which did not exist. Anyway, I was embarrassed to order that book from this little bookstore in San Diego that specializes in bringing Mexican books to the United States. And I was horrified that whoever delivered it to my door might know that I was reading this stuff. But anyway, so that took me in the direction of cultural history. And of course, I was informed by changes that had happened in our historical profession over the last 50 years. The cultural turn that treats historical texts as narratives, and the recent proliferation of memory studies that focus on the gap between memory and history. But mostly really this cultural, the section where I look at the stereotype, I look at these myths as they develop, I look at the fake facts as they're introduced, grew out of my teaching experience that showed the importance of learning how to evaluate texts critically, which is even more important now than when I read the book, because fake facts are being created and disseminated with breathtaking scale and speed. So critical reading skills, media literacy, it's much more important than ever. So that was one new direction I went in, which, as I said, was a lot of fun because these books are lots of fun to read. And then the other direction, and I'm glad your students appreciated this, is that I wanted to make this a book that was more accessible than my previous very dense monographs. So I avoided long footnotes. I figured I'm not a graduate student anymore. I don't have to list every book I've ever read on the independence period. I've been reading about it for 50 years and I couldn't even remember everything I've read, but I don't have those long footnotes that say, for more information on this topic, see. I really only cited, the things that I actually used. I also don't have a lot of theory, which I could have put in there. For example, I am really interested in the importance of social networks, which are often sustained through the hidden contributions of women, and they don't appear in official narratives. But your social network is so important to your survival in that time period, on any time period, but especially then. And so this is something that Pierre Bourdieu emphasized in his work, where he says, it's not just economic capital that the elites have. They have economic capital, of course, and she did have some money, although she lost a lot during the independence period. She also had cultural capital, which he talks about, because she was well-educated, she knew the law, she knew what her rights were, but she also had social capital, because she knew how to manipulate her connections, and she knew everybody who was important in that time period. It's really stunning who her lawyers are. Long before they become important independence figures, they're representing her in various court cases, who her friends are, like Agustin de Iturbide, the people who lend her money when she's in trouble, the fact that when her husband, who was first husband was very violent and abusive, she turned first to priests to try to control him, which is what Steve Stern would call the pluralization of patriarchs. If one patriarch is oppressing you, you try to get another one to balance him out. She turned first to priests, but when her husband came back from his haciendas and fired his gun at her, which fortunately didn't go off, she immediately ran to her parents' house and went with her father to the viceroy, right to the top. She didn't go to a local court. They knew the viceroy, and the viceroy placed her husband under false house arrest, and that's when he decided to accuse her of adultery and file for an ecclesiastical divorce, which, as I said, he then withdrew the charges and they reunited. And in his will, he says, get rid of that case. I don't want anything of those papers ever being read by anyone else. You know, it wasn't true. But the point here is that she knew how to manipulate her connections. She had a lot of social capital. When she didn't want to pay a debt, she actually, when things got really bad for her, she sold off her silver, she sold off her jewels, or some of her jewels. She went into business twice to try to sell, in this one case, very fine British stockings at a very, that she bought at wholesale to sell them at retail, but she never paid the merchant who sold them to her. And years later, he took her to court, and she managed to weasel out of that debt, which is a real debt. You can see there's a very long court case, very boring most of the time, but then all of a sudden you find these letters in there that are fantastic, and you find her saying things. And the most extraordinary thing is she gets out of paying the debt because she's friends with the audiencia judges, and she appeals it up to the audiencia. So she was a master at knowing how to manipulate her social networks to protect herself. Her father died in 1810. She never had a brother. Her uncle, one of her uncles died. All of her uncles died, you know, actually pretty early. And one of them went bankrupt, so he wasn't any help. So yes, she was on her own. And she said, I'm a poor woman, a poor widow with all these children. But in fact, she had a lot of protectors through the social network. But I didn't talk about Pierre Bourdieu, and I didn't talk about, you know, the pluralization of patriarchs. Larissa Lomnitz and Marisol Perez talk about centralizing women. Some women who are very strong centers of their family, collecting all the information that might be useful to them, disseminating the information, who needs a loan, who has money to lend, et cetera, et cetera. She was clearly a centralizing woman, but way beyond her family. When she spoke and spread gossip, it went down to the lower classes, according to the viceroy when he banished her from Mexico City for 2 months for having spread rumors that were threatening the legitimacy of the government. That was the 1809 intrigue, long before the Grito de Dolores, long before the independence movement. But I decided not to put the theory in there. I have an article I've written that'll come out someday. I don't know why it's taking so long, where it's much more theoretical and much more explaining some of these things. But I didn't want to turn off the undergraduates. And in Mexico, I wanted this book to come out for the bicentennial, which it did. And I wanted it to be widely read. I don't know how widely read it was, but it certainly, I didn't want to only be talking to scholars who do women's history or Mexican history of this time period. Because as I said, there are all these misconceptions about the time that just keep getting repeated because the wider public is not reading our works. And I was hoping in this book to change that. So I'm glad you liked it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Silvia. And I don't know if we have questions from the audience. We cannot see. But maybe while we are waiting for comments or questions, Silvia, your book is just wonderful. And I think that what you just explained us, there are two parts that I would like, maybe if you can explain further, why women were not minors before the law and why still that, how you say, that representation, it is still alive. And the other part that I think it is very important, not only for history or for a biography, is also, I think that your book goes further to our everyday life. how we get information through the news, TV, social media, and that we have to be aware about if this is a true fact or something that it was invented to twist some reality. So and that it is something that it is very, very common in everyday life. Sometimes by powerful men or very powerful TV networks or newspapers. So I think it has also this, it is for everyone to be aware what we learned and what kind of fact we are receiving. So it is something that we have to be alert always. So I would like to hear more about my first question. Mm-hmm.
Okay, in Roman law, women were lifelong minors, pretty close to that, and they did need guardianship all the time. And there have been those, part of it is the literature. There's a very famous legal scholar who went into exile from the Spanish Civil War, and he didn't have his books with him. And he sat down and wrote a treatise about Latin American law, but his section on women, he didn't have his books with him, and he just repeated what was in Roman law. So it's out there, it's in the legal treatises, people have believed it. But when you sit down and read the Siete Partidas and Leyes de Toro and all the laws that were the Novísima Recopilación and everything else that was the law in colonial Mexico, and you look at how things worked, you realize women were not perpetual minors. First of all, single women, once they were emancipated, and this is the same for men, if your father was alive, you were never emancipated in the colonial period. You were always an hijo de familia, and your father had certain control over you. But if they were emancipated, usually by the time they're 25, their father would be dead. In those days, people didn't live that long. A single woman or a widow, even if the widow was underage, she could be an 18-year-old widow, but she had full juridical capacity. She could, of course, not do everything a man did. I'm not saying that. I mean, women could not be in the government bureaucracy. They couldn't represent others in court as lawyers. They couldn't go to the university. They couldn't be priests. I mean, we know that. But in terms of managing their own affairs, their economic affairs, their property, their children, having power over their children, being able to head a household, etc., they had the same rights as men. And married women were the most restricted. And when people say married women had the same status as minors, when they say women had the same status as minor, they're thinking of the married women, who was very much under the control of her husband. But even then, he didn't own all her property. And if she could take him to court if he did something that was really bad for her property. She could dispose of her own property in her will without his permission. That's another stereotype that I find over and over again. That's British law. It's certainly not Latin American law. So even married women had certain rights that minors didn't have. And the majority of women in Mexico City in 1811, in that census, were not married. The majority of adult women were either single or widows. So the majority of women had full legal personalities. So it makes no sense to say that they were the same as minors. So that's why I say, now, why do we still believe it? In part because that mistake entered the literature by the book by Otzcaptegui, which I think was written in, I don't know, whenever 1940, maybe, the Spanish Civil War. And it's very appealing. We have this view that things must have been so terrible in the past and that we're so much better than they were. And so, of course, women were victims. Of course, women couldn't do anything. We exaggerate the extent to which their lives were restricted. Their lives were restricted in many ways, but not as much as we've said and as we want to believe, because we want to believe that history is a progression where everything gets better, and we are so much better than they were. But that's not actually the case.
Yeah, thank you. So someone, I think the Aristi Moreno says Mexico has the highest rate in adolescent pregnancy in the OCDE. The gender roles impact in the fact. What do you think about how you research about it?
Well, I didn't do research on, adolescent pregnancy in this time and place now, but certainly one thing that we can see over and over again in that second half of the book, where I'm looking at how people portray women, is that there are these very gendered stereotypes. So for most of the writers, and they're very persistent in our culture, most of the writers think that if a woman was powerful, and they claim she was, I don't think she was as politically powerful as they've said, it must be because she was doing this for love, not because she had strong political convictions. So everything she does is tied to her relationship to Iturbide, or in the case of that novel from 1949, her relationship to Bolivar, which was non-existent, and so on. So those gendered stereotypes that women are accessories to men, that or in the case of many writers about her, that she was so sensual that any man would just automatically fall for her. And so she couldn't have a friendship with a man. It had to be an affair. You see that over and over again in this literature. She had friendships with men that weren't affairs. Iturbide did go to her for advice. And one of the things he wanted was for his cousin to manage her properties. And his cousin did do that. And then served as her representative in court, because rich people didn't go to court. Men and women had representatives that they sent to court, these attorneys, apoderados. So there was a friendship there, but it didn't have to be love. That's one of those gendered stereotypes. And the fact that she is so sexualized, starting in 1949, not so much before that, so sexualized in the way that she is presented, even when feminists represent her as a strong woman, one of the things that is emphasized is her supposed sexual freedom, that she's sexually liberated, which she wasn't. She did have 3 husbands, but that's a different story, because the first 2 died. So certainly the gendered stereotypes, that gendered ideology is there, and it affected her. And one of the interesting things about the biography is we can see how she was able to navigate kind of this world where there are restrictions on women, to be able to defend herself using the law, using her social networks, etc., using her charms, which were many. So certainly gendered stereotypes are there, and gendered fantasies about what kind of a woman we would have liked to have had in the past.
I think there are no more questions, but I have one question about this biography. If we look at the footnotes, then there are a section that you can see that you did a deep family history. You did a lot of that reconstruction. Mm-hmm. Who was who in this different families and marriages. So can you develop about that?
That was actually some of the easiest research I did, because I found in the parish records, I found baptismal records and marriage records, and also a lot of them had now been copied by the Church of the Latter-day Saints, and you can even get them online, although I had to go to the cathedral for some of them that weren't available. So finding out who married whom and who had children, and the wills are fantastic sources for finding out who your children are. So you read the literature about her, she had 3 children. She had 7 children. 2 of them died in infancy, one of them at age 15. 2 of her daughters died as young adults, one in childbirth. Well, if you look at her will, she says it very clearly. And she's written a couple of wills. So that information is out there. So putting together, then there are also works genealogical works in Mexican history. They sometimes have mistakes in them, but her daughters, the three daughters, married three of the most eligible men in the realm. I mean, she really steered them, in a very good way, educated them very well. And they were noblemen. So their families show up in these genealogical studies. And so I also use them to trace her children, her grandchildren. I didn't go much further than her grandchildren, except in the case of Manuel, I can't remember his name, who wrote about her in the early 20th century, her great, I think 5 times grandson. So that part, I just put it in an appendix. I didn't want to load the book with all these names and, who married whom. And unless you're a specialist in Mexico City, those names don't mean anything to you, but they're there. They're there for those who want it. But that was much easier than reading through these documents, these court cases that can be hundreds of pages long, where you read all this boring stuff and then all of a sudden something fantastic. Notarial records, again, can be incredibly boring. And then all of a sudden you realize something important. You can piece together the life. Census records don't tend to be that interesting either, but they can tell us a lot. They help us to reconstruct a life, especially for a person like this, whose archive of personal letters I have not been able to find, if they still exist.
There is one more question by Atsiri Moreno. In terms of gender, what changes and similarities are still prevalent in the poor population, in Mexican poor population?
Well, again, I haven't studied that. But one thing that that I can see in what I did cover for the 20th century is that over time, the authors are celebrate women's political participation. So that's one change in gender ideology. They celebrate this increasing status of women. We can see that by comparing some of the older texts that say, no, she had nothing to do with politics, with some of the newer texts that say, oh, she was a political actor and this was fantastic. Of course, women are political actors. So it was a slow change, because even after Vallerispe said she was a great political actor in 1949, another author came along a couple decades later and said, no, she just had all these levers under the sheets and she wasn't a political actor at all. So it takes a while for that to change. I haven't actually done an anthropological study of what poor people in Mexico believe and whether machismo is stronger in that population. And I wouldn't want to repeat stereotypes, because what I have found is that we have so many stereotypes. And then sometimes when you go and get into the material, you realize that you were wrong. So I don't want to get into that and make any generalizations that might not be true. Certainly the feminist movement in Mexico is, very strong, both in terms of the movement that allowed for the legalization of abortion, and in terms of the various marches that we see for against feminicide. So, I mean, something has changed. Women are out on the streets, and obviously they're in politics. The next president of Mexico may be a woman. So something has changed very gradually from La Guera's day, when a woman could not go to the university or even think about being a president or a head of state, unless she was a queen, but that's another story. The monarchy is another story.
Yeah. So, Margaret, do you want to say something more, to comment more, something?
And my voice is going, for one thing, and for another thing, I think I've said what I wanted to say. Okay,
thank you. So it seems that we don't have more questions. But I think congratulations for this wonderful book, Silvia, because as you mentioned, you wanted a book more directed to certain kind of students or to a general audience. So it is very, very successful. And we have to to use this book in our different seminars. So.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real honor to get this prize and to hear both of you talk so positively about the book and so eloquently.
It's a wonderful book. Okay.
Yeah, and Atsiri Moreno says congratulations. So thank you, Atsiri Moreno, for being here and making 2 questions and comments. And we don't have more questions.
And thank you for leading this event on Zoom. I realize not having a live audience makes it hard to have questions. But it's wonderful to see both of you, even if only virtually.
It's being recorded, I think. This is, I mean, I do think this happens with Zoom, right? That people are not there in the moment, but later they're not there to ask questions, but it doesn't mean that they're only the 3 of us that are ever going to hear this, and not Siri, who are ever going to hear this conversation.
And if people do have questions and they want to send me email, I'll be happy to answer them.
Good. So I don't know if we just finish this and yeah, okay. Thank you, Margaret, for the wonderful presentation of Silvia and Silvia. So it is always a pleasure to hear you, and I bet that this many people will see this video later on, and probably they will use it in a class too, to make to hear the author talking about the book directly, not only reading the book, but listen what you are saying and how you get to the book and the years that it took you and how you combine different primary sources and different historical perspectives. That in the biography, you have to pull together different resources and perspectives to reconstruct the life, understand the life of a human being. So thank you, muchas gracias por estar aquí presentes, felicidades y pues un gusto estar. Hasta luego.
Gracias.
Bye.